ballroom looked like something out of a movie. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, shining warm golden light across polished floors. Round tables were covered in white cloth, decorated with tall flower arrangements and flickering candles. Soft laughter floated through the air as guests in elegant clothes moved from one group to another, holding glasses and exchanging polite smiles. Everything felt expensive, carefully planned, and perfectly arranged. At one corner of the room stood a grand piano. It was glossy black, spotless, almost glowing under the lights. Most guests barely noticed it. It was simply part of the decoration, something that added class to the evening. Earlier, a professional pianist had been hired to play soft background music while people talked. But just before the main part of the event began, quiet news spread among the staff that the pianist had suddenly fallen ill and could not continue. The music stopped. At first, no one paid attention. Conversations continued, but slowly, the silence where music once flowed began to feel awkward. The event organizer whispered urgently to the hotel manager. The manager looked around with concern. They needed someone, anyone, to fill the empty space with sound. Among the catering staff was a young woman carrying a tray of glasses. She moved carefully between tables, keeping her head slightly lowered, making sure not to disturb the guests. She had worked at many events like this before. Weddings, business dinners, award ceremonies. She was used to blending into the background. One of her co-workers, trying to be helpful, casually mentioned to the manager, "She plays the piano a little." The young woman froze when she heard that. The manager turned quickly. "You play?" She hesitated. "Just a little," she answered softly. It wasn't exactly a lie. She did play, but she had never played at an event like this. Never in front of wealthy strangers dressed in suits and shining jewelry. Never under bright lights with so many eyes watching. The organizer looked relieved. "Perfect. We don't need anything serious. Just something light. Something casual while people talk." A nearby guest overheard the conversation and chuckled. "Yes, just something simple. We don't need a concert." A few people laughed lightly. It wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. It was the kind of laughter that reminded her of her place in the room. She swallowed slowly. Her hands felt cold. She had flour on her sleeve from helping in the kitchen earlier. She quickly wiped it away, suddenly aware of how different she looked compared to the guests. For a brief moment, she thought about refusing. She could say she wasn't ready. She could step back into the kitchen and let them solve the problem another way. No one truly expected much from her anyway. But something inside her shifted. She had not touched a real grand piano in years. At home, she practiced on an old keyboard with 2 broken keys. Sometimes the sound would cut out. Sometimes one side was louder than the other. But she played anyway. Music had always been her quiet world. When life felt heavy, when money was tight, when responsibilities piled up too quickly, she would sit down and let her fingers move. The small room at home would fill with sound, and for a few minutes, nothing else mattered. Now, that same instrument, only far more beautiful, stood just a few steps away. The manager gestured toward it. "Go ahead. Just something soft." She placed the tray down carefully on a nearby table. Her legs felt strangely weak as she walked toward the piano. The room did not fall silent for her. In fact, most people barely noticed she was moving. A few glanced over with mild curiosity. Others continued discussing business deals and travel plans. When she reached the piano, she paused. Up close, it looked even more stunning. The surface reflected the chandeliers like tiny stars. She could see her own reflection faintly staring back at her. For a second, she barely recognized herself. She gently pulled out the bench and sat down. The fabric of her simple uniform felt out of place against the polished wood. Her heart beat loudly in her chest. She rested her fingers lightly on the keys but did not press them yet. Across the room, someone said jokingly, "Let's see what she's got." Another voice added, "As long as it's not too dramatic." More light laughter. She closed her eyes for just a moment. She remembered being a child, sitting on the floor next to a neighbor's old piano, watching carefully as hands moved across the keys. She remembered going home and trying to copy the sounds on a small toy keyboard. She remembered saving small amounts of money for lessons but never having enough for formal training. So she learned from listening, from repeating, from making mistakes and trying again. No one had clapped for her practice sessions. No one had dressed up to hear her play. The only audience she ever had was herself. She took a slow breath. The first notes were soft and simple, exactly what they had asked for. A light melody that blended into the air without demanding attention. Something gentle, something easy. Conversations continued. Glasses clinked. Her fingers moved carefully at first, adjusting to the feel of the grand piano. The keys were smoother than she remembered. The sound was richer, deeper. Even the softest touch carried beautifully across the room. She played a familiar tune, one she often used to warm up at home. It was calm and pleasant. A few guests nodded slightly in approval as if to say, "That's fine." But as she continued, something inside her relaxed. The nervous shaking in her hands slowly disappeared. The piano no longer felt like an object in a grand hall. Felt like an old friend. She allowed herself to feel the music instead of worrying about the room. Her left hand added a slightly stronger rhythm. Her right hand began to explore higher notes. The melody grew more layered, more textured. Still soft but fuller. A couple at the nearest table stopped talking for a moment. They turned slightly toward the sound. She didn't notice. She was remembering late nights when the world was asleep and she would practice quietly with headphones plugged into her keyboard. She remembered how she would close her eyes and imagine performing somewhere beautiful, somewhere big, somewhere that mattered. Now she was there. The simple tune began to shift. Almost without planning it, she blended it into something deeper. The chords became more emotional. The rhythm gained confidence. Across the room, conversations began to slow. A man who had been checking his phone looked up. The organizer, who had been pacing nervously earlier, stopped walking. The music was no longer just background noise. It had shape. It had direction. Her back straightened slightly. Her fingers moved with more certainty. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was simply playing the way she always played when she was alone. The melody rose gently, like a story beginning to unfold. One by one, more guests turned toward the piano. The laughter faded. No one said anything, but the energy in the room began to change. The casual request for something simple had quietly become something more meaningful. She still believed she was just filling in for a missing musician. She had no idea that, in those first few minutes, something important had already begun. Her heart no longer raced with fear. It beat steadily, in rhythm with the music. And as her fingers continued to move across the shining keys, the ballroom, once filled with scattered conversations, slowly began to listen. The sound of her playing began to travel farther than she expected. What started as soft background music was no longer hiding behind conversations. It was moving through the room, touching people in small but noticeable ways. A few guests who had been standing near the back slowly turned their bodies toward the piano. Someone lowered their glass without realizing it. The room wasn't silent yet, but it was changing. She still kept her eyes mostly on the keys. She didn't want to see the expressions on people's faces. She didn't want to know if they were impressed or amused. It felt safer to focus on the black and white pattern beneath her fingers. Near the center table, a group of business partners who had been discussing numbers and contracts began to lose track of their conversation. One of them paused mid-sentence and tilted his head slightly. "Is that the staff member playing?" he whispered. Another nodded slowly. "I think so." There was no laughter this time. At the edge of the room, the event organizer crossed their arms and watched more closely. Just minutes ago, they had been worried about embarrassment. Now their expression held surprise. This was not what they expected from someone who carried trays and cleared plates. The young woman felt something shift inside her. The first layer of nervousness had melted away, but a new feeling replaced it. Awareness. She could sense that people were listening now. Truly listening. Her fingers almost hesitated. For a second, she thought about pulling back. Maybe she should return to something lighter. Maybe she had already gone too far from the casual tune she was asked to play. She remembered the joking comments. Nothing serious, nothing dramatic. But music had never been casual for her. Music was the only place where she did not feel small. She let her left hand deepen the sound, adding stronger chords. Her right hand moved with more confidence, weaving a melody that felt honest. It was no longer just a tune. It was a story told without words. At a nearby table, an older woman leaned forward slightly. Her eyes softened as she listened. She wasn't smiling in a polite way anymore. She looked thoughtful, almost emotional. Across the room, a younger guest who had been scrolling on a phone slowly placed it face down on the table. The sound coming from the piano felt different from the typical background music at formal events. It wasn't mechanical or rehearsed in a cold way. It felt alive. The young woman's breathing matched the rhythm of the piece. She forgot about the uniform she was wearing. She forgot about the trays waiting to be carried back to the kitchen. In that moment, she wasn't staff. She wasn't invisible. She was simply a musician. A small memory flashed in her mind. She saw herself years ago, sitting in a crowded living room where relatives talked loudly over each other. She had tried to play on her small keyboard in the corner, but no one paid attention. Someone even told her to turn it down because it was distracting. She remembered how that felt, like her passion was something unimportant. Now, in this grand ballroom, people were turning toward her instead of away. She didn't rush the music. She allowed each note to settle into the air before moving to the next. The sound of the grand piano carried beautifully. Even soft touches felt powerful in the high-ceiling space. A waiter passing by slowed down and stood still for a moment. He had worked beside her for months and had no idea she could play like this. His eyes widened slightly with quiet pride. The melody shifted again. It grew more layered, more emotional. Not loud, not aggressive, just deeper. The kind of music that makes someone stop thinking about what they were saying. The room gradually fell into near silence. It didn't happen all at once. One conversation ended. Then another. Chairs stopped scraping against the floor. Even the gentle clinking of cutlery faded. She could feel it now. The silence around her. Her heart beat a little faster, but not from fear. It was the kind of excitement that feels warm instead of sharp. She realized she had a choice in that moment. She could continue playing it safe, or she could allow the music to grow into what it truly wanted to become. She chose the second option. Her fingers moved into a more complex pattern. The rhythm became stronger. The melody rose higher, carrying more emotion. It was no longer something that blended into the background. It demanded attention, not in a loud way, but in a way that felt impossible to ignore. At the front of the room, a guest who had earlier made a joking comment now stared openly at the piano. There was no smile on his face, only surprise. The organizer slowly walked closer, as if drawn by the sound. The young woman's posture straightened without her thinking about it. Her shoulders relaxed. She was no longer playing to fill silence. She was playing because she had something to say. Every note felt personal. Each chord carried years of quiet practice, frustration, hope, and determination. She had learned without expensive lessons. She had practiced without applause. She had improved without encouragement. Now all of that lived inside her hands. She didn't look at the audience, but she could feel their attention like a gentle spotlight. The melody built slowly, climbing higher, weaving emotion into every corner of the ballroom. It was no longer possible for anyone to pretend it was just background music. An older gentleman near the stage cleared his throat softly, almost as if he felt something in his chest. A young woman near the back pressed her lips together, eyes fixed on the pianist. The energy in the room had completely shifted. Earlier, the event felt formal, almost stiff. Now it felt connected, unified by sound. She reached a softer passage and let the notes fall gently, like a quiet conversation between her hands. The silence in the room became even deeper. It wasn't awkward anymore. It was respectful. She could finally hear the full power of the grand piano responding to her touch. The instrument felt alive, responding to every small change in pressure. A thought crossed her mind. They didn't expect this. Not because she wanted to prove them wrong, but because she knew how quickly people make assumptions based on appearance. She remembered arriving early that evening, helping arrange chairs, polishing glasses, staying unnoticed while guests arrived in luxury cars. No one had looked at her twice. Now every eye was on her. The melody began to rise again, gently building towards something stronger. She allowed her emotions to guide her hands. The music felt honest, almost vulnerable. She wasn't performing for praise. She was sharing something real. A guest near the front slowly stood up, not to leave, but to see better. Others leaned forward in their chairs. For the first time since sitting down, she briefly lifted her gaze from the keys. She didn't scan the room fully. She only glanced upward for a second. What she saw made her breath catch. No one was laughing. No one was whispering. They were listening, truly listening. She lowered her eyes back to the piano, a quiet strength settling inside her. Whatever happened next no longer felt frightening. The doubt that had surrounded her when she first walked toward the piano had faded completely. The casual tune had transformed into something much bigger. And the night, which had begun with uncertainty and polite indifference, was slowly turning into something unforgettable. By now, the room had completely surrendered to the sound of the piano. What began as a simple request to fill silence had quietly turned into the center of the evening. No one had planned for this moment, yet it felt more real than anything else that had happened that night. She could feel the weight of the attention, but it no longer frightened her. Felt steady, almost warm. The grand piano responded beautifully to her touch, and with every passing second, her confidence grew stronger. Her hands moved with more freedom now. The melody she had been building slowly was ready to rise into something greater. She let her fingers travel into a higher register, adding brightness to the sound. The notes shimmered in the air under the chandeliers. A soft murmur of surprise passed through a few guests as the music shifted again. This was no longer just emotional and gentle. Carried skill. Carried control. The transitions were smooth, deliberate. She wasn't guessing her way through the piece. She knew exactly where she was going. At the back of the room, two guests who had stepped outside earlier quietly re-entered. They paused at the doorway when they heard the music. Instead of walking back to their table, they stood still, listening. The event organizer, who had once been nervous about embarrassment, now stood near the piano with folded hands, almost protective of the moment. They had stopped checking their watch, stopped worrying about schedules. Time itself seemed to slow. She allowed the music to soften briefly, giving the audience space to breathe. Then she introduced a new pattern, one that felt more intense. Her left hand carried a steady rhythm, while her right hand danced quickly across the keys. A few guests exchanged glances. This was not beginner playing. This required training, dedication, countless hours of repetition. Her face remained calm, but inside, memories were unfolding. She remembered practicing when her fingers hurt. She remembered feeling frustrated when she couldn't master a difficult section. She remembered almost giving up many times because it felt unrealistic to dream of playing in places like this. But she never stopped. Even when no one noticed, she continued. The melody now climbed higher, stronger, fuller. It wasn't loud in a harsh way. It was powerful in a controlled way. Every note landed with intention. A man near the front table slowly stood up without realizing it. His chair scraped softly against the floor, but he didn't sit back down. His eyes stayed fixed on her hands. Another guest, who had earlier made light jokes, now looked almost uncomfortable, not from annoyance, but from the realization that he had underestimated her. She could sense the shift in energy, but she didn't play for their reaction. She played for the story unfolding inside the music. Her shoulders moved gently with the rhythm. Her breathing remained steady. She no longer felt like someone filling in temporarily. She felt like she belonged exactly where she was sitting. The piece she was shaping now held layers of emotion. Strength, hope, determination. It mirrored her journey in ways the audience could not fully understand, yet somehow they could feel it. The room was silent except for the piano. No clinking glasses, No whispered conversations. Only music. She transitioned into a section that required precision. Her fingers moved quickly but cleanly, never missing a note. The grand piano responded with rich, resonant tones that filled every corner of the ballroom. A quiet gasp escaped from someone near the back. The older woman who had been listening thoughtfully earlier now had tears in her eyes. She pressed a napkin gently to the corner of her eye, surprised by her own reaction. She didn't know why the music affected her so deeply. It just did. The young woman at the piano felt something rising inside her too. Not nerves, not fear, but emotion. She let it guide her hands. She wasn't thinking about technique anymore. She wasn't calculating the next note. She trusted herself completely. The melody slowed briefly, becoming tender. Soft notes fell like quiet confessions. It felt intimate even in a large hall. Some guests leaned forward in their seats, afraid to miss even a single sound. Then slowly she began to build again. The rhythm strengthened. The tempo increased. The sound grew fuller, bolder. It felt like a story reaching its turning point. Her fingers moved with certainty now, gliding across the keys as if they had always belonged there. The confidence she once hid inside small rooms at home now shone openly in front of everyone. A few guests who had been seated far away quietly stood and moved closer. Not to interrupt, but to witness. The event no longer felt like a formal gathering. It felt like a shared experience. The music swelled, rising toward something greater. Each chord felt like a declaration. Each note carried years of silent effort. She remembered the broken keys on her old keyboard, the uneven sound, the small space she practiced in. And now here she was, seated at a grand instrument in a hall filled with people who once barely noticed her. The contrast was almost overwhelming, but she didn't let it distract her. She reached the most demanding section of the piece, the part that required both speed and emotional control. Her fingers moved quickly, yet her posture remained steady. The room held its breath. The notes cascaded beautifully, flowing like water. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only clarity. One guest quietly whispered, "This is incredible," though no one answered. They were too focused on listening. She felt completely connected to the music now. The world outside the piano faded away. It was just her and the instrument, speaking a language without words. As the melody approached its highest point, she allowed it to stretch, to soar. The sound filled the ballroom in a way that felt almost physical. The final build began. It wasn't rushed. It was careful, deliberate, powerful. Her hands moved in harmony, strong chords anchoring the piece while the melody climbed above them. It felt like everything she had held inside for years was finally being released. A wave of emotion passed through the audience. Some sat frozen. Some blinked back tears. Some simply stared in disbelief. The young woman didn't look up. She poured the last of her energy into the closing movement, allowing the music to rise one final time before gently descending. The final notes began to slow. Each one lingered in the air a little longer. The room was so quiet that the soft echo of the piano could be heard bouncing gently off the walls. She pressed the final chord and let it fade. Her hands remained on the keys for a second longer, as if holding onto the moment. Then she slowly lifted them. Silence. Not the awkward silence from earlier in the evening. A deep, stunned silence. The kind that comes when people don't immediately know how to respond to something powerful. She lowered her hands to her lap, her heart beating steadily again. She had been told to play something casual. Instead, she had given them something unforgettable. And in that suspended second before the first clap, the entire room understood that they had just witnessed far more than background music. For a brief moment after the final note faded, no one moved. It was not the kind of silence that feels empty. It felt full, heavy with emotion. The last chord still seemed to hang in the air, as if the walls themselves were holding on to it. She slowly lowered her hands from the keys and placed them in her lap. Her fingers felt warm, slightly shaky now that the music had stopped. While she had been playing, everything felt steady. Now reality was rushing back. She wondered if she had gone too far. She had been asked to play something light, something simple. Instead, she had poured her heart into the piano without thinking about limits. For a split second, doubt returned. Maybe she had made it too serious. Maybe she had crossed an invisible line. Then it happened. One clap, clear and strong, came from somewhere near the front of the room. Another followed. Then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom erupted into applause. It wasn't polite clapping. It wasn't forced or careful. It was loud, genuine. Some people even stood up without realizing it. The sound of hands meeting filled the space that had been so silent just moments before. Her eyes widened slightly. She hadn't expected this. She looked up for the first time properly. Every face that had once shown mild curiosity or quiet amusement now carried a different expression. Respect, surprise, admiration. The older woman who had been emotional earlier was standing now, clapping with tears still in her eyes. A man near the center shook his head slowly, almost in disbelief, while applauding. Even the guest who had made a light joke earlier was clapping harder than most. She felt her throat tighten. She had played countless times alone in her room, finishing pieces with no applause at all. Sometimes she would sit there in silence afterward, wondering if she was good enough for anything beyond those four walls. Now the sound of appreciation surrounded her from every direction. She stood slowly from the bench, unsure of what to do next. She wasn't used to being the center of attention. She gave a small, shy nod, unsure whether to bow or step away. The applause continued longer than she expected. The event organizer approached first, clapping while walking toward her. The expression on their face was completely different from earlier in the evening. Gone was the worry and nervous tension. In its place was admiration. They paused, searching for words. That was extraordinary. She gave a small smile, still overwhelmed. Thank you. The organizer gestured toward the audience. I think you gave them more than we planned. A few guests laughed softly at that, but it wasn't mocking laughter. It was warm. Someone from the crowd called out, "One more!" Another voice followed, "Please, another piece." She hadn't prepared for this part. Her heart began to race again, but this time it wasn't from fear of embarrassment. It was from the sudden realization that people wanted more. She glanced at the piano. The instrument that had once felt intimidating now felt inviting, like it was encouraging her to continue. The applause slowly faded into hopeful silence. She hesitated only a second before sitting back down. This time, she didn't feel like someone filling in temporarily. She felt invited. She placed her fingers on the keys again. The room quieted instantly, as if everyone was afraid to disturb the moment. She chose a different piece this time. Something softer at first, but equally powerful. She allowed the melody to unfold gently, not rushing, letting the audience settle back into listening. The second performance felt different. The first had been unexpected, raw, almost accidental in its intensity. This one felt intentional. She was aware of the room now, aware of how deeply they were listening. But instead of pressure, she felt connection. She noticed small details between phrases. The way someone leaned closer. The way a guest clasped their hands together. The way the organizer stood quietly near the side, no longer thinking about schedules or formalities. The ballroom no longer felt divided between guests and staff. For those minutes, everyone was simply an audience sharing the same experience. As she played, a staff member quietly dimmed the lights slightly, not as part of any plan, but because it felt right. The softer lighting made the moment feel even more intimate. Her music flowed smoothly, confident and controlled. She allowed her emotions to guide her again, but this time there was a calm strength beneath it. Halfway through the piece, she briefly looked up again. Instead of seeing wealth and status, she saw people. People moved by sound. People surprised by what they had just discovered. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong anymore. It wasn't about shock or disbelief. It was about connection. When she reached the end of the second piece, she slowed the tempo carefully, letting the notes fall gently like a soft landing. The final chord echoed lightly, then faded. This time, the applause came immediately. Stronger. Some guests even whistled softly in appreciation. A few people exchanged excited whispers, clearly discussing what they had just heard. She stood again, feeling slightly breathless. A man in an elegant suit approached the piano with a thoughtful expression. He introduced himself politely and asked where she had studied music. She hesitated. "I didn't study formally," she admitted. "I learned mostly on my own." He blinked in surprise. "On your own?" She nodded. Another guest joined the conversation, clearly impressed. "You have remarkable control and expression. That doesn't happen by accident." She wasn't sure how to respond to that. She had never thought of her years of quiet practice as remarkable. To her, it was simply something she loved. More guests began to gather near the piano, not crowding her, but standing close enough to speak. Compliments came from different directions. "You're incredibly talented. That was beautiful. You changed the entire atmosphere of the evening." Each word felt unreal. Just an hour ago, she had been carrying trays, blending into the background. Now she stood surrounded by people who were genuinely interested in her story. The event organizer gently touched her shoulder. "Would you consider performing at our future events? As a featured pianist?" The question felt almost too big to process. She glanced around the ballroom again, taking in the chandeliers, the polished floors, the faces still glowing with admiration. A simple request for background music had turned into something much bigger. She nodded slowly. "Yes, I would." A smile spread across the organizer's face. "Good, because tonight you didn't just fill silence. You created something unforgettable." As conversations resumed around the room, they felt different now. Lighter, warmer. The music had softened the space between people. She stepped away from the piano at last, her hands still tingling slightly from the performance. The grand instrument remained where it was, shining under the lights. But it no longer looked like decoration. It looked like the beginning of something new. And as she quietly walked toward the side of the room, no longer invisible, she realized that this night had changed more than just the mood of an event. It had changed how she saw herself. The rest of the evening no longer felt like the same event. After she stepped away from the piano, conversations slowly restarted, but something had shifted. The tone of the room was warmer, more connected. Guests who had been discussing contracts and investments were now talking about music. People who had barely looked toward the stage earlier were still glancing at the piano as if expecting it to come alive again. She returned briefly to the staff area, unsure of what she was supposed to do next. A part of her wondered if she should pick up a tray again and continue working as if nothing had happened. That had been her role when the night started. But as soon as she entered the hallway near the kitchen, her co-workers surrounded her. "You never told us you could play like that," one of them said, eyes wide with disbelief. Another shook their head, smiling proudly. "You changed the whole room." She felt shy under their attention. "I was just playing," she said softly. But even as she said it, she knew it was more than that. The manager came through the doors a moment later, looking excited. "They're asking about you," they said. "Several guests want to speak with you again." Her heart skipped. She hadn't expected ongoing attention. She thought the applause would fade and the night would move on. Instead, it seemed like the performance had become the main memory of the evening. She took a deep breath and stepped back into the ballroom. This time, people noticed her immediately. A few guests smiled as she walked by. One even gently tapped a friend's arm and pointed in her direction, as if saying, "That's her." She approached a small group near the front who had been waiting. The man in the elegant suit from earlier spoke first. "I've attended events like this for years," he said calmly. "I've heard many professional musicians. But what you did tonight felt different." She listened quietly. "It wasn't just skill," he continued. "It was honesty." His words stayed with her. Another guest asked if she performed publicly anywhere else. She explained that she mostly practiced at home and occasionally played at small local gatherings when invited. "You should be on bigger stages," someone else said. The idea felt both exciting and frightening. Bigger stages meant bigger audiences. More eyes. More expectations. Before she could think too deeply about it, a younger guest approached holding a phone. "I hope you don't mind," they said, slightly nervous. "I recorded part of your performance." Her eyes widened slightly. "You did?" "Yes. It was too beautiful not to capture." She wasn't sure how to feel. The idea of her playing being recorded and possibly shared made her stomach flutter. But at the same time, it felt like proof that the moment had been real. "May I share it?" the guest asked politely. She hesitated for a second, then nodded. "That's fine." The guest smiled brightly. "People need to hear that." As the evening continued, more guests approached with similar words. Some asked about her journey. Some simply thanked her for making the night special. A few handed her business cards, encouraging her to stay in touch. She carefully placed the cards in her pocket, still trying to process everything. At one point, she found herself standing alone near the piano again. The crowd had thinned slightly as dinner resumed. The instrument sat quietly under the chandelier, no longer just decoration. She reached out and lightly touched its smooth surface. Just hours ago, she had approached it with hesitation and doubt. Now it felt familiar. The organizer joined her again. "I meant what I said earlier," they told her gently. "We would like you to perform at our future events. Not as staff, as the pianist." Hearing it repeated made it feel more real. "What about tonight?" she asked quietly. "Am I supposed to continue working?" The organizer shook their head with a small smile. "Not tonight. Tonight you're our musician." Those words settled deeply inside her. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine something different for her future. Not just occasional playing in small rooms. Not just practicing alone, but performing openly. Later in the evening, she was invited to play once more before the event ended. This time it was officially announced. The organizer stepped to the front and tapped a glass lightly for attention. "Before we close the evening, we have one more gift," they said. "The remarkable pianist who surprised us all earlier has agreed to play again." Applause filled the room before she even sat down. She walked to the piano with steady steps. There was no nervous laughter this time. No whispered doubts. Only anticipation. She chose a piece that meant something personal to her. One she used to play during difficult days when she needed hope. As she began, the room fell silent once more. But the silence felt different now. It wasn't curious. It wasn't skeptical. It was respectful. Her fingers moved with confidence, but also gratitude. Every note felt like a thank you, to the piano, to the unexpected opportunity, to the moment that had changed everything. She didn't hold back. She allowed the music to rise and fall naturally, letting the story unfold. Midway through, she saw something that nearly made her emotional. Several staff members had quietly stepped into the ballroom to watch. People who had worked beside her for months stood near the back, smiling proudly. She wasn't invisible to them anymore either. When the final piece ended, the applause was immediate and heartfelt. Some guests stood again. Others simply closed their eyes for a second, as if holding on to the feeling. As she stood from the bench, she realized something important. The biggest change wasn't the applause. It wasn't the business cards in her pocket. It wasn't even the offer to perform again. It was the way she felt inside. For years, she had loved music quietly, almost secretly. She never allowed herself to fully believe that it could become something more. Tonight, that belief had shifted. She understood now that talent doesn't need permission to exist. It doesn't need a title or expensive training to matter. Sometimes it only needs a chance. As the event slowly came to an end, guests said their goodbyes. Many stopped to thank her personally before leaving. A few mentioned they were looking forward to seeing her perform again. When the ballroom finally began to empty, she stood alone for a moment in the center of the room. The chandeliers still glowed softly. The tables were half cleared. The piano remained still. She took a slow breath. Just hours earlier, she had walked into this room as background. Now she was leaving it as something entirely different. And though she didn't know exactly what would happen next, one thing was certain. This night was not the end of a story. It was the turning point. When the last guest finally left and the ballroom lights were dimmed, she stood near the doorway for a quiet moment. The room that had been filled with applause and attention was now calm again. Staff members moved around clearing tables, folding linens and stacking chairs. It almost felt like the night had reset itself. But she knew nothing was the same. She picked up her small bag from the staff corner and stepped outside into the cool night air. The noise of the city felt different somehow. Cars passed, people walked by, and streetlights flickered softly. Everything looked ordinary, yet inside her, something had changed forever. On the way home, she replayed the evening in her mind. The first nervous step toward the piano, the light laughter, the silence after the final note, the applause that followed. It all felt unreal, like a dream she might wake up from. But when she reached into her pocket and felt the business cards still there, she knew it was real. At home, her small room greeted her quietly. The old keyboard sat in its usual place near the wall. 2 keys still slightly uneven. A faint scratch across the top from years of use. She placed her bag down and walked toward it. For a moment, she simply looked at the keyboard. So many nights had been spent here. So many doubts had been faced here. So many silent promises to herself had been made here. She sat down and pressed one key gently. The sound was smaller than the grand piano at the ballroom. Less powerful, but it was familiar. She smiled softly. That night she didn't practice for long. She didn't feel the need to prove anything. Instead, she allowed herself to rest, knowing something new had begun. The next morning, her phone buzzed earlier than usual. Messages. At first, she assumed it was work-related. But when she opened her phone, she froze. Clips of her performance were already being shared online. The guest who recorded part of it had posted a short video with a simple caption about discovering hidden talent at an event. The video was spreading quickly. Comments poured in. Who is she? This is incredible. Pure talent. She stared at the screen, heart beating faster. She had never imagined her playing would reach beyond that ballroom. Now strangers were watching, listening, sharing. More messages arrived throughout the day. Some from guests at the event. Some from people she didn't know at all. A local music teacher asked if she would consider performing at a community concert. A small cultural center sent an invitation for an upcoming event. By afternoon, even the event organizer called her directly. You won't believe the response, they said excitedly. People are asking about you. We've already scheduled you for 2 future events as the featured pianist. She sat quietly, trying to absorb it all. What if I'm not ready? She asked honestly. There was a pause on the other end of the call. You were ready last night, the organizer replied gently. You just didn't know it yet. Those words stayed with her long after the call ended. Over the next few weeks, her life slowly began to shift. She continued working part-time, but now her schedule included rehearsals for upcoming performances. Instead of hiding her passion, she spoke about it openly. Instead of practicing only late at night, she practiced with purpose. The first official performance after the ballroom event felt different. It was announced in advance. People arrived specifically to hear her play. She wore a simple but elegant dress, chosen carefully. When she walked onto the stage, there was no surprise this time. Only expectation. And yet, she felt calmer than ever. She realized something important. The fear she once felt had come from hiding, from shrinking herself, from believing she didn't belong. Now, she understood that she belonged exactly where her music took her. Word continued to spread. Not in a dramatic overnight fame kind of way, but steadily, quietly, like her music itself. She was invited to play at charity events, cultural gatherings, private celebrations. Each performance brought new connections, new opportunities. Some evenings were small and intimate. Others were grand and formal. But no matter the setting, she carried the same feeling inside her, gratitude. One afternoon, months after that first unexpected performance, she received a letter in the mail. It was handwritten. It came from the older woman who had wiped tears during the ballroom performance. The letter described how the music had reminded her of her late husband, who had loved classical piano. She wrote that for the first time in years, she felt a beautiful memory instead of sadness. As she read the letter, tears filled her own eyes. That was when she truly understood the impact of what she did. It wasn't about applause. It wasn't about recognition. It was about connection. Years later, when people asked her how her journey began, she would smile and say it started with a simple request. Just play something light. She often thought about that sentence. If she had chosen to stay quiet that night, nothing would have changed. If she had limited herself to what others expected, the moment would have passed unnoticed. Instead, she chose to be honest through music. She didn't unleash a masterpiece to impress anyone. She simply allowed herself to play fully. The grand ballroom became a memory she would always treasure. Not because it was luxurious, not because it was filled with wealthy guests, but because it was the place where she stopped doubting herself. Sometimes she would return to that hotel for performances. The staff who once worked beside her now greeted her differently, not with distance, but with pride. They would smile and say, "We remember the first night," and she remembered too. The nervous steps toward the piano, the laughter, the silence, the applause. Every part of it mattered, because that night taught her something bigger than music. It taught her that talent does not need permission. It does not need the perfect moment. It only needs courage. And whenever she sat at a piano now, whether in a grand hall or a small community room, she carried that lesson with her. She was once told to play a casual tune. Instead, she found her voice, and she never let it fade again.